12-year-old Marcus Chen lay sprawled across the cold gymnasium floor. His round face flushed crimson with exertion and humiliation. Above him towered HOA Nguyen, the newly appointed head of student physical development, her shadow stretching like a dark specter across his trembling form. Her thin lips curved into what might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the cruelty burning in her coal-black eyes. "Get up, you pathetic excuse for a student," Hoa spat, her Vietnamese accent making each word sound like a whip crack. 50 more jumping jacks, and this time, maybe you won't collapse like a deflated balloon." Marcus struggled to his knees, his oversized PE uniform clinging to his sweat-soaked body. Around him, 20 other sixth graders stood frozen in terror, their young faces etched with the kind of fear that would follow them into adulthood. None dared to speak. None dared to move. They had learned, through weeks of systematic torment, that any sign of sympathy would only make Hoa's wrath burn hotter. What none of them knew was that every gasp, every cruel word, every moment of degradation was being captured by the tiny camera lens hidden behind the emergency exit sign. The red recording light blinked steadily, a digital witness to the unfolding tragedy. 3 months earlier, Lincoln Elementary had been a place where children laughed during recess and teachers smiled in the hallways. The previous PE instructor, beloved Mr. Rodriguez, had retired after 30 years of service, leaving behind a legacy of encouragement and joy. The principal, Mrs. Patterson, had been desperate to fill the position quickly as the school year approached its peak testing season. Hoa Nguyen had arrived with impeccable credentials. A former Olympic training camp assistant from Vietnam, she possessed certifications that sparkled like fool's gold across her resume. Her references spoke of discipline, results, and transformation. What they failed to mention was the trail of broken spirits she had left behind in her previous positions. "Children today are soft," she had declared during her interview, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been questioned. "They need structure. They need to understand that weakness is a choice, not a condition." Mrs. Patterson, overwhelmed by budget cuts and state mandates, had been impressed by Hoa's confidence. The school board, desperate for someone who could improve their dismal physical fitness scores, approved her hiring within a week. It was a decision that would haunt the Riverside Community School District for years to come. The first signs of trouble emerged within days of Hoa's arrival. Teachers began noticing that their students returned from PE classes subdued and anxious. Children who had once bounded through the hallways now walked with downcast eyes and slumped shoulders. Parent complaints started trickling in, but Hoa was quick to dismiss them as the whining of overprotective families raising weak children. "In my country, we understand that strength comes from adversity," she would tell anyone who questioned her methods. "American children are spoiled. They need to learn what real discipline looks like." But Marcus Chen's torment went beyond mere discipline. From the moment Hoa laid eyes on his stockier frame and gentle demeanor, she had marked him as her primary target. His crime was not defiance or disrespect, but simply existing in a body that didn't conform to her rigid standards of what a child should be. The abuse began subtly. Extra laps around the gymnasium while other students rested. Criticisms disguised as instruction. "Marcus, your form is sloppy because you carry too much weight. Perhaps you should consider eating less and moving more." The other children would snicker nervously, grateful that her attention wasn't focused on them. As weeks passed, the psychological warfare escalated into physical humiliation. Hoa would force Marcus to demonstrate exercises in front of the class. Knowing he would struggle and fail, she would make him hold planks until his arms gave out, then berate him for his weakness. "Look at him, class. This is what happens when you don't take care of your body." You become a burden to yourself and others. The breaking point came on a gray Thursday morning in November. Marcus had been suffering from a mild cold. His breathing labored and his energy depleted. When he asked to sit out the more strenuous activities, HOA's response was swift and vicious. Excuses are for the weak, Marcus, and you've made quite enough excuses for one lifetime. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her fingernails digging into his soft flesh. Today, you're going to learn what it means to push through discomfort. What followed was 45 minutes of systematic torture, disguised as physical education. HOA forced Marcus to perform jumping jacks until his legs shook uncontrollably. When he stumbled, she made him start over. When he gasped for breath, she accused him of theatrical dramatics. The other children watched in horrified silence as their classmate was reduced to a sobbing, exhausted heap on the gymnasium floor. "Please, Ms. Nguyen, I can't do any more," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above his ragged breathing. "Can't?" HOA's voice rose to a shriek that echoed off the gymnasium walls. "There is no can't in my class. There is only won't, and too lazy to try. Which one are you?" "Marcus." She grabbed him by the collar of his PE shirt and dragged him across the polished floor, his knees scraping against the unforgiving surface. The sound of fabric tearing mixed with his muffled cries as she deposited him in the center of the room like a piece of unwanted garbage. "Everyone gather around," she commanded, her voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "I want you all to see what happens when someone gives up on themselves." The students formed a reluctant circle around Marcus, their faces pale with shock and fear. Some of the girls were crying silently, tears streaming down their cheeks as they witnessed their friend's degradation. The boys stood rigid with anger and helplessness, their small hands clenched into fists they were too young and scared to use. Unknown to HOA, one of those students was Emily Rodriguez, daughter of the former PE teacher. Emily had inherited her father's sense of justice and her mother's technical skills. Weeks earlier, disturbed by the stories she was hearing from her classmates, she had convinced her older brother to help her install a hidden camera in the gymnasium. The device, no larger than a button, had been recording everything. "Look at him," HOA continued, her voice taking on the tone of a nature documentary narrator describing a diseased animal. "His body is soft because his mind is soft. He has no discipline, no self-control, no pride. Is this what you want to become?" Marcus tried to push himself up from the floor, but his arms gave out. The combination of exhaustion, humiliation, and the cold he was fighting had pushed his young body beyond its limits. As he collapsed again, a wet cough escaped his lips, specks of blood staining the gymnasium floor. The sight of blood should have stopped any reasonable adult. It should have triggered concern, medical attention, and immediate care. Instead, it seemed to fuel HOA's rage further. "Pathetic," she hissed, her voice now barely above a whisper, but carrying the force of a thunderclap. "In my country, children half your age show more courage than you're showing right now." What HOA didn't know was that Marcus Chen was not just any child. His mother, Dr. Rebecca Chen, served as the elected mayor of Riverside, a position she had won through a platform of protecting children and strengthening communities. His father, Captain David Chen, was the highest-ranking Asian American officer in the county police force, a man who had dedicated his career to fighting injustice in all its forms. The Chen family had emigrated from Taiwan when Rebecca was pregnant with Marcus, seeking the American dream of opportunity and freedom. They had worked tirelessly to build their lives, to contribute to their community, and to raise their son with the values of kindness, respect, and perseverance. Never in their darkest nightmares had they imagined that their child would face such cruelty in an American public school. Marcus had been hiding the extent of HOA's abuse from his parents, partly out of shame and partly out of fear that his complaints would only make things worse. He had learned, as many children do, to internalize the blame for his suffering. Maybe he was too soft. Maybe he did need to be stronger. Maybe this was just how the world worked. But as he lay on the cold gymnasium floor, tasting blood and feeling the weight of 20 pairs of frightened eyes upon him, something fundamental shifted in Marcus's understanding of right and wrong. This wasn't about strength or weakness. This wasn't about discipline or character building. This was simply cruelty, pure and unmasked. "I want to call my parents," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying a note of quiet determination that made HOA's eyes narrow with suspicion. "Your parents!" She laughed, a sound like glass breaking against concrete. "Your parents sent you to school to learn, not to run crying to mommy and daddy every time life gets difficult. Besides, what could they possibly do, Sue? The school complained to the principal. I have tenure. Little boy, I have protections. I have rights." Her mistake was in assuming that all parents were as powerless as she had led them to believe. Her mistake was in not researching exactly whose child she had chosen to torment. Her mistake was in believing that her credentials and connections would shield her from the consequences of her actions. The hidden camera continued to record as HOA forced Marcus through another round of exercises, each one designed to push him closer to complete physical collapse. She made him crawl on his hands and knees around the gymnasium perimeter, while she followed behind, offering commentary on his weakness and inadequacy. Faster. Marcus. A real student would have finished this lap by now. But then again, a real student wouldn't be carrying all that extra weight, would they? The other children watched in stunned silence as their classmate was systematically broken down. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Others looked away, unable to witness the degradation any longer. A few of the older boys took half steps forward, their young minds struggling with the instinct to protect their friend and the learned fear of adult authority. It was Emily Rodriguez who finally broke the spell of terrified inaction. As HOA prepared to force Marcus into yet another humiliating position, Emily stepped forward, her small voice cutting through the gymnasium's oppressive atmosphere like a knife through silk. "Stop it," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You're hurting him. This isn't right." HOA spun around, her face contorting with rage at this unexpected challenge to her authority. "Excuse me, did you just tell me how to do my job? Little girl." "My dad was a PE teacher for 30 years, Emily continued, her courage growing with each word. "He never hurt anyone. He never made kids cry. He never dragged them across the floor or called them names. What you're doing isn't teaching. It's bullying." The word bullying hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Around the gymnasium, 20 young faces turned toward Emily with expressions of awe and terror. She had dared to say what they had all been thinking, to name the unnamed horror they had been witnessing for weeks. HOA's response was swift and vicious. "Since you seem to have so much energy for running your mouth, Emily, perhaps you'd like to join Marcus in his exercises. In fact, I think the whole class needs a reminder about respecting authority and following instructions without question." What followed was a mass punishment that would have been familiar to anyone who had studied the psychology of authoritarianism. HOA forced the entire class to perform grueling exercises while she screamed insults and threats. She made them hold painful positions until their muscles screamed in protest. She singled out the smallest and weakest for special attention. using their struggles as teaching moments about inadequacy and failure. But her greatest mistake was in not noticing the small red light, blinking steadily from behind the emergency exit sign. The camera Emily had placed was capturing every moment of abuse, every cruel word, every violation of basic human dignity. The evidence was mounting with each passing minute, building a case that would soon bring down the house of cards HOA had constructed around her reign of terror. As the class period mercifully came to an end, the students filed out of the gymnasium like survivors of a natural disaster. They moved slowly, carefully, afraid that any sudden movement might draw HOA's attention back to them. Marcus was among the last to leave, struggling to gather his backpack and water bottle with hands that still shook from exhaustion and trauma. "Remember, children," HOA called after them, her voice returning to its false sweetness, now that her fury had been spent. "What happens in physical education stays in physical education. Your parents wouldn't understand the methods we use to build character. They might even try to interfere with your education if they heard exaggerated stories about our training sessions." It was a threat disguised as advice, a warning wrapped in the language of protection. She was counting on the children's fear, their shame, their learned helplessness to keep her secret safe. But she had underestimated the power of documentation, the courage of young people pushed too far, and the fury of parents who discover their children have been harmed. That afternoon, Emily Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home to her usual after-school routine, she detoured to the public library and used one of their computers to download the video footage from the hidden camera. Her hands trembled as she watched the playback, seeing her classmates suffering through the objective lens of digital recording. The footage was worse than she had remembered. In the heat of the moment, focused on survival and protecting her friends, she hadn't fully grasped the calculated cruelty of HOA's actions. But watching it back, seeing Marcus's face as he was dragged across the floor, hearing the exact words HOA had used to degrade and humiliate him, Emily understood that she was witnessing something that went far beyond strict teaching or tough love. She made copies of the video file, saving them to multiple email accounts and cloud storage services, with the technical savvy of a generation raised on digital media. Then, she made the most important decision of her young life. She was going to tell the truth. Consequences be damned. Her first stop was Marcus's house. The Chen family lived in a modest but well-maintained neighborhood where American flags hung from front porches and children's bicycles dotted the sidewalks. Emily had never spoken to Marcus's parents directly, but she knew they were important people in the community. Everyone knew Mayor Chen, and everyone respected Captain Chen. When Rebecca Chen opened the front door, she found a slight 11-year-old girl with tears streaming down her face and a flash drive clutched in her trembling hand. "Mrs. Chen," Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm Emily Rodriguez. I'm in Marcus's PE class. I need to show you something. It's about what's been happening to Marcus at school." Rebecca Chen had been a politician long enough to recognize the moment when everything changes. She saw it in Emily's eyes, heard it in her voice, felt it in the electric tension that seemed to surround the child like an invisible storm cloud. Without hesitation, she invited Emily inside and called for her husband. Captain David Chen emerged from his home office still wearing his uniform, his badge catching the late afternoon light streaming through the living room windows. He had been reviewing case files for an upcoming trial, but something in his wife's tone told him that those files would have to wait. "Emily has something to show us about Marcus's PE class," Rebecca said, her mayor's instincts already shifting into crisis management mode. What followed was 23 minutes of footage that would be burned into the Chen family's memory forever. They watched in growing horror as their son was systematically abused, degraded, and tortured by an adult who was supposed to be protecting him. They saw him dragged across the floor like a piece of debris. They heard him called names that no child should ever hear. They witnessed his physical and psychological destruction at the hands of someone they had trusted with his care. David Chen's training as a police officer had exposed him to humanity's darkest impulses. He had seen crime scenes that would haunt most people's nightmares. He had interviewed victims of the most heinous acts imaginable, but nothing had prepared him for watching his own child suffer while he sat helpless. Seeing it for the first time through the unblinking eye of a digital camera. Rebecca Chen's political career had taught her to control her emotions, to think strategically, even in the face of crisis. But as she watched her son's humiliation play out on the laptop screen, she felt something primal and fierce rising within her. This wasn't about politics or public relations or managing a scandal. This was about protecting her child from a predator who had been given institutional power to harm him. "How long has this been going on?" David asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Weeks," Emily whispered. "Since Ms. Nguyen started. It's not just Marcus. She's been hurting all of us. But Marcus gets the worst of it. We tried to tell our parents, but she always said that complaining would just make things harder for us." Rebecca and David exchanged a look that communicated volumes. They were both thinking the same thing. How had they missed this? How had their son been suffering in silence while they went about their daily routines? How had the system they had sworn to protect and serve failed so completely? "Where is Marcus now?" Rebecca asked, suddenly realizing that her son wasn't home yet. "He stayed after school for tutoring," Emily said. "He's been doing that a lot lately. I think he's been trying to avoid going home because he doesn't want you to see how upset he is." The revelation hit both parents like a physical blow. Their son had been protecting them from his own suffering, carrying the weight of abuse alone because he was afraid of worrying them or disappointing them. The strength it must have taken for a 12-year-old to shoulder that burden was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Emily, you've been incredibly brave to come forward with this," David said, his police officer's instincts kicking in even as his father's heart was breaking. "I need you to know that you've done the right thing, and that what you've shown us is going to help us make sure this never happens to another child." "Will Ms. Nguyen get in trouble?" Emily asked, her voice small but hopeful. "She's going to face the full consequences of her actions," Rebecca said, her mayor's voice carrying the weight of official authority. "No one hurts children in our community and gets away with it." That evening, as Marcus finally came home from his extended day at school, he found his parents waiting for him in the living room. Their faces were serious, but gentle, their arms open and ready to provide the comfort he had been denying himself for weeks. "Son, we need to talk," David said, his voice soft but filled with love. "We know what's been happening in PE class. We know what Ms. Nguyen has been doing to you." Marcus's carefully constructed walls of silence crumbled in an instant. He collapsed into his parents' arms, sobbing with the relief of a child who had been carrying a burden too heavy for his young shoulders. Through his tears, he told them everything: the daily humiliations, the physical abuse, the fear that had consumed his days and haunted his nights. "I thought maybe I deserved it," he whispered against his mother's shoulder. "She said I was weak. She said I was a disappointment. She said I needed to be stronger." "Listen to me, Marcus," Rebecca said, her voice fierce and protective. "Nothing that woman did to you was about making you stronger. It was about her own sickness, her own cruelty. You are perfect exactly as you are, and no one has the right to make you feel otherwise." That night, while Marcus slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, His parents began planning their response. David reached out to his contacts in the district attorney's office, sharing the video evidence and building a criminal case. Rebecca called an emergency meeting with the school board, preparing to hold the institution accountable for allowing the abuse to continue. But they also did something that would prove to be even more powerful than legal action or political pressure. They reached out to other parents in the community, sharing Emily's video and asking them to check with their own children about their experiences in HOA's class. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Parent after parent came forward with stories of changed behavior, mysterious injuries, and whispered complaints from their children. A pattern emerged of systematic abuse that went far beyond Marcus's individual experience. HOA hadn't just targeted one child. She had created a reign of terror that had affected dozens of families. Mrs. Patterson, the principal who had hired HOA, found herself facing a crisis that threatened to destroy her career and her school's reputation. The video evidence was undeniable, but the scope of the problem was far larger than anyone had imagined. She was forced to confront the reality that her desperation to fill a staff position had led to a catastrophic failure in her duty to protect the children under her care. The breaking point came 3 days later, during what was supposed to be a routine PE class. HOA, unaware that her secret had been exposed, continued her pattern of abuse with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. She had targeted a new victim, a quiet girl named Sarah, who had made the mistake of asking to use the restroom during exercises. Bathroom breaks are for people who plan ahead. HOA sneered, forcing Sarah to continue running laps, despite the obvious discomfort on the child's face. Maybe next time you'll think before you interrupt my class with your bodily functions. What HOA didn't know was that this particular PE class had some unexpected observers. Principal Patterson had positioned herself outside the gymnasium doors, finally ready to witness firsthand what had been happening under her watch. Captain Chen was waiting in the main office, coordinating with school security and preparing to make an arrest. Mayor Chen was in the parking lot with a team of social workers and child psychologists, ready to provide immediate support to the traumatized students. The plan was to observe one class period, gathering additional evidence, and ensuring they had enough documentation to make charges stick. But as they watched HOA force Sarah to continue exercising, despite clear signs of distress, they realized they couldn't wait any longer. The gymnasium doors burst open with a bang that echoed through the large space like a thunderclap. Principal Patterson strode in first, her face pale but determined. Behind her came Captain Chen, his uniform and badge immediately commanding attention from every person in the room. The students, who had been going through the motions of their exercises in terrified silence, stopped and stared in amazement. "Ms. Nguyen," Principal Patterson's voice cut through the gymnasium like a blade. "Step away from the students immediately." For the first time since her reign of terror had begun, Huang Nguyen looked genuinely surprised. Her carefully constructed mask of authority slipped, revealing the uncertainty and fear beneath. "Principal Patterson, I don't understand. We're in the middle of a lesson." "The lesson is over," Captain Chen said, his voice carrying the full weight of law enforcement authority. "Huang Nguyen, you're under arrest for child abuse, assault, and endangering the welfare of minors." The students stood frozen in disbelief as they watched their tormentor's face cycle through shock, rage, and finally, desperate calculation. HOA's eyes darted around the gymnasium, looking for escape routes or explanations that might save her from the consequences of her actions. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered, her authority crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. "I'm a certified educator. I have tenure. These children are just oversensitive. Their parents don't understand proper physical education techniques. "We have video evidence of your abuse," Captain Chen said as he approached with handcuffs ready. "Weeks of documentation showing you systematically tormenting children. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights were read and the handcuffs clicked into place, something shifted in the gymnasium's atmosphere. The students, who had lived in fear for so long, began to understand that their nightmare was truly over. Some began to cry with relief. Others stood taller, their postures straightening as the weight of oppression lifted from their shoulders. Marcus, who had been excused from PE class that day as part of the investigation, arrived just in time to see HOA being led away in custody. The woman who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable, looked small and pathetic as she was escorted through the hallways where she had once ruled through fear. "Is it really over?" he asked his father, his voice still carrying traces of the fear that had dominated his life for weeks. "It's over, son," Captain Chen said, putting a protective arm around Marcus's shoulders. "She can never hurt you or any other child again." The aftermath of HOA's arrest sent shockwaves through the entire school district. Investigation revealed that she had left a trail of abuse at her previous positions, but had managed to escape consequences through a combination of intimidation, institutional protection, and the silence of victims too young or scared to speak up. The video evidence Emily had captured became the cornerstone of both criminal and civil cases against HOA and the school district. Child psychologists testified about the long-term damage caused by systematic abuse. Educational experts explained how HOA's methods violated every principle of effective teaching and child development. During the trial, which drew national media attention, 23 students testified about their experiences in HOA's class. Their words painted a picture of sustained psychological and physical torture that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Hua Nguyen was sentenced to 5 years in prison and permanently banned from working with children in any capacity. The school district paid millions in settlements to affected families and implemented comprehensive reforms to prevent similar abuse in the future. Principal Patterson resigned in disgrace, her career ending with the knowledge that her failures had enabled unthinkable harm to the children she was supposed to protect. But perhaps the most important outcome was what happened to the students themselves. United by their shared trauma and their collective courage in speaking truth to power, they formed bonds that would last a lifetime. Emily Rodriguez became a hero to her classmates, celebrated for her bravery in exposing the abuse. Marcus Chen, supported by his family and community, began to heal from his ordeal and eventually became an advocate for other children facing similar situations. The gymnasium where so much suffering had occurred was renovated and renamed the Rodriguez Family Fitness Center, honoring both Emily's courage and her father's decades of positive impact on students' lives. A new PE teacher was hired, someone whose philosophy centered on building confidence rather than tearing it down, on celebrating effort rather than punishing failure. On the anniversary of HOA's arrest, the school held a special assembly about courage, justice, and the importance of speaking up when witnessing abuse. Marcus took the stage, no longer the frightened child who had been dragged across the gymnasium floor, but a confident young man who understood his own worth and power. "What happened to us was wrong," he told the packed auditorium, his voice strong and clear. "But what happened after that proves that truth is more powerful than fear, that justice is possible when people choose to act with courage, and that no one is too small to make a difference." In the audience, his parents watched with pride as their son transformed his suffering into strength, his trauma into triumph. Emily Rodriguez sat in the front row, wearing a Medal of Honor from the local police department for her role in exposing the abuse. Around them, the entire community that had been torn apart by one person's cruelty was coming together in a celebration of healing and hope. The story of Hoa Nguyen became a cautionary tale told in education circles across the country, a reminder that institutional authority must be coupled with accountability, that credentials mean nothing without character, and that the voices of children must be heard and believed when they speak of their suffering. But for the students who lived through her reign of terror, it became something else entirely. It became proof that evil, no matter how entrenched or protected, cannot withstand the power of truth revealed. It became evidence that courage, even in its smallest forms, can topple the mightiest tyrannies. It became a foundation for lives built on the unshakable knowledge that they deserved respect, kindness, and protection. Years later, when Marcus Chen became a police officer like his father, and Emily Rodriguez became a teacher like hers, they would carry with them the lessons learned in that gymnasium. They would remember that justice delayed is not justice denied, that children's voices matter, and that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change the world. The sound of flesh hitting linoleum would never again echo through the halls of Lincoln Elementary, but the sound of children's laughter would ring out for generations to come, a testament to the power of truth and the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to be broken.